Good afternoon. I don't think it's controversial to say that as a society we face some pretty big challenges. In fact, societies throughout history have waxed and waned, great societies. And many of those societies have waned because of their energy and energy use. What's new, I think, today is that we're, as a global community, facing a crisis which is because of our lifestyle choices or our individual choices that can infect the entire planet. And I think that a big part of that problem has to do with the fact that we've really externalized our energy and the implications of our energy. It wasn't that long ago that we didn't really have this electricity infrastructure. That, for example, we put up windmills on farms in order to pump water, in order to irrigate our crops or get the water that we needed. We knew that we had to store seeds for the next year to have another harvest. And if we didn't do that, it would simply not be sustainable. And in fact, in many parts of the world today, the grid infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, is very much not reliable, and people have to plan for that. But we have come to expect that when we flick a switch, we'll get a spark or a light bulb right away. We'll get that light coming on, and we shouldn't think about the consequences of it, how it got there, or what was needed to make that happen. The only thing we should think about is that maybe we could complain about how much our electricity bill is. And this presents a very enormous problem, and I think I have a way around that problem that I'd like to talk about today. In order to do that, I'd like to take a little bit of a trip through certain parts of time and space on our planet. And I'm going to start my talk on a little island of Svalbard, which is formerly part of the Kingdom of Norway. This picture is taken about almost 80 degrees north. It's closer to the North Pole than it is to the mainland. And it's where Amundsen did his first voyage to the North Pole in a dirigible. And it's a very, very beautiful and interesting place. It's rather a barren land. It's a land that would be hard to eke out an existence on, and yet that is, of course, done. It's a violent land. You can have massive glaciers calving, massive icebergs, to very violent eruptions into the ocean causing reflections in the bay and the jostling of your ship and boat. And that leads to a tremendous, tremendous beauty. And of course, it's a beauty that maybe we don't realize when we're looking at it, that what we're seeing is the melting of ice that was formed 10,000 years ago. Ice that may well not be forming again, certainly if things continue the way they are right now. And this conveys sort of the power of that, of that ice. That is over 3 stories high, that glacier front, and that was the bit of ice that you just saw calving in that rather violent event. But this is the land where the Svalbard reindeer makes his home. And they do this very, very well. And you can see again the barrenness of that land. But this itself right here is a little bit of an oasis. Up on the cliffside, birds are nesting there. Those birds are laying eggs, which the foxes are coming and eating, and the birds themselves are fertilizing that ground, and you're getting small bits of vegetation. This, of course, was taken in July at the absolute height of the summer in the high Arctic. And that time is very short. And so in order to live and eke out an existence in this land, this creature, as any creature that's lived up there, that lives up there, has evolved in very interesting ways to match that environment. The obvious thing you see when you look at this picture is the fact that there's a very, very thick coat here. Part of it coming off because this is the summer, and that's very natural. They need to shed that in the summer so that they don't overheat, and they grow it again in the winter because they have this short summer period to increase their body mass by something like 50%. Why? To give them the energy that they need to charge their batteries enough that they can fuel their metabolism throughout the winter and keep their body temperature at the temperature that it's required to be. And they need to not waste any heat when they do that. But there's another less obvious part of this picture that is absolutely fascinating. The nose on the front of those guys is an integrated heat and moisture recovery unit. If you see a reindeer breathe in the winter, you do not see their breath like you see ours. And this is critical. Not only are they not wasting the heat when they breathe out 40-degree air into the minus 40 environment, which they've heated up, but they're not losing the water. Because if they lost the water, they've got to maintain their hydration by eating snow. And when they eat that snow, they've got to first melt it, and then they've got to bring it up, perhaps 80 degrees temperature change, and they wouldn't survive the winter. What was I doing floating around Svalbard? Well, I was lucky enough to be a guest of the Norwegian Academy of Sciences, and we were there to observe Arctic wildlife in its environment. It was a program called Nature-Inspired Chemical Process Design. And it was something to see that. But that doesn't really roll off the tongue very well. I had a colleague on the trip with me who's a chemical engineer, and he does a lot of nature-inspired chemical engineering, which is reasonably nice. I myself am a mechanical engineer, and that's, in some contexts, not quite as nice. It certainly doesn't roll off the tongue as well. But what I really learned from this was that we have significant needs. And there's a lot of inspiration in nature, and especially in these Arctic animals. What I learned is that if we want to survive, we need to live harmoniously with our environment. We have a need for nature-inspired, energy-efficient design. And if we do this, we can live harmoniously in our environment. And so now I'm going to move in space, not really in time, but in space, I suppose. This is now in the southwest corner of Colorado, in the Four Corners area. And in fact, this picture was taken just after myself and my kids witnessed the last space shuttle launch. It was a tremendous juxtaposition. Here on these mesotops, from about the year 500 to 1200, the ancestral Puebloans survived on the three sisters of corn, squash, and beans, farming those mesotops. Somewhere around the last 100, 150 years of their civilization, they moved from those mesotops into the sides of these hills, into some very neat environments in the alcoves in this sandstone. And this provided some amazing benefits for these peoples. They built these cities. About 100 people would live in this city. There was a water supply because the sandstone is porous. Water would filter through it and hit a granite layer and then seep up into these alcoves, providing water for the communities. The shade at the top of this would block the summer sun and make the alcoves cooler than being up on the mesotop. And in the winter, the sun could still get in because it's at a lower angle and provide a little bit of heat. But in addition, a small spark, a small fire, could heat that space fairly reasonably. They also had wonderful places for storing their grain, and the massive thermal mass, or the energy stored in that massive hunk of sandstone, was able to help keep that warm. And so that's really neat. They were living in some ways harmoniously with their environment as well. And somewhere in the 60s in Taos, New Mexico, not far from there, an architecture student noticed this and designed houses based on this concept. This is called an earthship. They've been around since the 60s. They've been demonstrated in many, many climates across this globe, and they're really neat. They don't have any active heating or cooling systems, yet they maintain the environment of the house very close to room temperature year-round in all these different climates. In addition, they capture their own rainwater. They filter and treat their own wastewater, first irrigating the vegetables and the fruit that is grown in the house. It provides a substantial amount of its own food. And, of course, it harvests its own energy. So these are completely off-grid, often made with recycled materials, and have very low impact on their environment, very low energy inputs. So that's pretty cool. But it's not exactly how we do things. If we think back to our energy systems, I'm going to talk first about electricity. What we tend to do to get that electricity that we expect to be on at the flick of a switch is we build massive power plants. And if we're not lucky enough to have renewable resources, we're going to build nuclear plants or we're going to build fossil fuel plants. We're going to develop that electricity on an extremely large scale and deliver it to our cities and all the end needs that we have through these transmission lines. If we're lucky, like in Canada or Norway, we have renewable resources that we can apply in large scales, but this is by no means equitably distributed around the globe. But this really is only part of our energy system. It was mentioned earlier today, the transportation energy system and the emissions that came out of the transportation system. That's a big part of our energy and our emissions, a very significant part. And if we look at that system, it's very, very similar, except we have a different fuel in there. We're mining resources that were sequestered millions of years ago that take very, very long times in order to replenish those resources. And we're mining them and transporting them by a ship, pipeline, rail car, truck, and bringing them to our cities to provide the heat that we need in many cases, and certainly to provide our transportation infrastructure. I think it's very clear, I think everybody can understand that this is not sustainable. We're taking something that took a very long time to store, and we're using it at a very rapid pace. By its very fundamental definition, this is not sustainable. There are many definitions of sustainability, but of course, it involves acting in ways that do not impede future generations to enjoy their life as well. And this, of course, is the statement from the report, from the Brundtland report. And it's a very interesting note that Brundtland spent about 10 years being the Prime Minister of Norway. This perhaps might explain why sustainability is much more ingrained in the Scandinavian culture than perhaps it is in Canada, where we do a lot of mining of those fossil fuel resources, which of course they do in Norway as well. And so we need to do things different if we want to be sustainable. Now let's take that system that we just looked at and let's imagine it with renewable resources, right? We'll just substitute those nuclear power plants for, say, wind turbines. We'll make sure we have more hydroelectric resources. We'll put up solar panels. Germany's doing a fantastic job of this right now. But this isn't really solving the problem. And in fact, there's very big challenges with doing this. We have on Wolf Island a lot of wind turbines. If you ever go look at one, you'll notice how large it is. That wind turbine is 90 meters towers. The tower is 90 meters tall, and the blades are over 40 meters long. And in order to replace, for example, the Pickering nuclear plant, we'd need 2,000 of those, except really we'd need a lot more, because about 20% of the time only these things generate energy. So that means we need about 10,000 of them to replace the Pickering nuclear plant. And in addition to that, we still wouldn't have solved the problem that we can flick that switch whenever we want. We'd still be at the mercy of the weather patterns and the wind patterns. And so we really need to think about things a little bit differently. And it reminds me of my undergraduate days when I was taking my first ever algebra course. And in solving algebraic equations, the professor said, you could multiply both sides by 0, but this is like killing the informant. And I thought, that's really curious, that's really funny. I mean, I guess those are the great things. It's those quirky things from your professors that you're going to remember years later. And I just thought it was bizarre for the longest time. But then I started to think about things that I'd seen in my life. Way back, even before that time, I saw my first solar calculator. And that was pretty cool. It didn't work all that well. If you blocked the solar panel, it went off. You couldn't always have it on. But it was pretty neat. Other than the energy that went into building that device, it worked in perpetuity. That was pretty neat. More recently, I visited an energy institute for research in Europe, in the Netherlands, and they gave me this as a parting gift. It's a very nice flashlight that has a solar panel on it, except this one has a very nice lithium-ion battery in it, and so it works very, very well, and I have a reliable source of light that never needs an energy input. I had the pleasure of being in Okinawa, Japan earlier this year, and I saw these light stands, these street lights. We're very proud in Kingston that we've replaced all our street lights with high-efficiency LED light bulbs, greatly reducing our electricity consumption, and that's a very great thing to have done. But look what they did in Japan. They did a very elegant design of integrating solar panels on all sides of those things, so there's no wires. These things aren't connected to any grid or any power plant. They're just like my flashlight and my solar calculator. And this brings me back to 0. 0 is a very neat number. That's what's common about all these systems. Once you build them, they have 0 emissions and 0 inputs, and they do their job for very long periods of time. Now, 0 is something that's not very obvious at all. Many great civilizations, the Romans and the Greeks, for example, didn't really understand 0 at all. They might have had it as a placeholder in their abacus when they didn't put a bead there, but they didn't really understand what that meant. It wasn't until about the 8th century in India that this kind of equation came about, and that we realized that we could use nothing as something, that we could multiply something by 0, and the answer was 0. And this, to me, is the way out of this logjam. If we can replace our systems with 0 emission, 0 consequence systems, we can grow them as much as we want, and we're not going to create a problem, because anything times 0 is 0. Now, the key to all this is the technology that I spend most of my research days studying. I spend a lot of time in the minutiae of these devices trying to make them less expensive and more durable so that we can build more of them and have them out there in our society. But this is a fuel cell. And it can take a fuel, like hydrogen, for example, but many others, and it can split it directly into protons and electrons. The electrons go around our circuit, giving us our spark or our light in a direct conversion from the chemical energy of that fuel to electricity. Unlike making heat turn something and then making a generator turning generate those electrons. And so there's a direct conversion. It's higher efficiency. It's also very neat because the fuel is separate from the device, much like our cars and our gas tanks. We can refuel this very quickly just by putting more fuel into it, and the device is unchanged. But even more great is that you can run it backwards. When you have the energy, if the wind is blowing on Wolf Island and we have lots of wind turbines turning, we can take this water that was produced when that hydrogen combined with oxygen to make water, apply electricity to this device, and instead make the water split into hydrogen and oxygen, regenerating that fuel. And that is a really, really interesting prospect, because now we have a convergence between that transportation and heat fuel and our electricity infrastructure. When we have too much electricity, we can produce fuels, and we can either use those fuels to power our automobiles or our other transportation needs, or we could even make heat with it if we really wanted to, or we can go back and make electricity with it and put it back on the grid, getting over this storage problem and having the possibility of truly having a sustainable, renewable energy infrastructure that meets the needs of society. In fact, if we build this from the ground up, and we do it differently than these large systems that seem to be intractable, 10,000 wind turbines to replace the Pickering nuclear plant, but instead we go back to the ancestral Puebloans and the earth ships, and we build our houses this way. We build them efficiently like the reindeers, and we generate electricity with them. We can then provide a net zero home, and we can all build these homes maybe out of wood like we saw earlier, and we will have no impact. Furthermore, with these technologies, we can produce our own fuels. We can produce the hydrogen that we can put in our vehicles, and with that size of solar panel, I'm quite confident that we can power our houses exactly the way we do now and fuel our gas tanks in our vehicles at least once a week. We can even have excess, and as a community, sell it to those travelers that are trying to get from Ottawa to Toronto via Kingston, for example. And we can save the big stuff, the wind turbines and the bigger renewable energy resources to power our industries, and still have a solution that works very much like it does today, but it's fed from the bottom up. Now, these are technologies that exist. I myself have driven fuel cell cars on over 3 continents, hydrogen-powered fuel cell cars on over 3 continents. This is the opening of the first hydrogen fueling station in Norway in 2006. Many of these are being built. They're even close to home. Here's another one that runs on both gasoline and hydrogen. You can switch which it is at a push of a button if you can't happen to find your hydrogen. A good transition vehicle. This is on the CNE grounds in Toronto. At the base of that wind turbine, there was an electrolyzer and hydrogen storage and a hydrogen fueling station just up the road in Toronto. These are here, they work. I'm working to make them better. But the really neat thing about all this, of course, is I go back to the zero, and I go back to the math around zero. If we raise anything to the zero power, what's the answer that we get? We get 1, the individual, me, you, all of us individually, internalizing the consequences of our energy use. And we can build that up from that level, where we have the early adopters and the leaders showing others the way to follow. Excuse me. Where we can build that up into our individual houses, network those together into our communities, and bring it all together from the bottom up to be a truly zero-emission, sustainable energy system that meets our transportation and mobility needs. Why aren't we doing this? I need to quote Hamlet, and I need to quote Hamlet based on one of my mentors, David Scott. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not now, I can't, it's too small for me to read. This is Hamlet, it's a wonderful quote, and the end of the quote is saying, if it will be later, the readiness is all. Ladies and gentlemen, the readiness is all. Thank you very much.